Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am the Robert Hershtick Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Executive Medical Director of Northwestern Simulation. I would like to welcome you back to Part 2 of our podcast interviewing Dr. Barry Issenberg, the Michael S. Gordon Endowed Chair and Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. In part 1 of the podcast, you previously talked also about integrating more with the health system. At Northwestern, we have a unique situation where the Sim Center is owned by the medical school and the health system is a different organization. How does it work at the Gordon Center?
It's a great question, and I was remiss of not kind of providing that background about what is the Gordon Center. And so at the University of Miami, it has traditional clinical departments and basic science departments. But about 20 years ago, they started, the dean realized that more and more of what we do in academic health institutions is cross-disciplinary, cross-departmental, transdisciplinary. And there was a need to establish centers that weren't specific to a traditional clinical department or basic department. And so the Gordon Center is officially within the University of Miami designated as a center of excellence with its own cost center, meaning we're not within the Department of Medical Education's budget or the Department of Medicine's budget. We have our own budget. And as director of the Gordon Center, I report directly to the dean and chief academic officer. I also have a clinical appointment within the Department of Medicine. But in terms of the role, the operation, the strategic planning, the budgets of the Gordon Center, it's a direct report to the dean. And I will say up until about 10 years ago, the Gordon Center ran almost as an independent unit, as its own fiefdom. It certainly did work supporting the medical school and to somewhat the residency program, but often just out of sheer necessity because we didn't have support from those bodies, did our own work. We did a lot of innovative work, developed programs, but we were known more outside of our own institution than inside our institution. And I could see that while that would certainly be effective when you're just establishing a simulation center, particularly with someone who's as successful as Michael Gordon was in raising independent funds, it wasn't sustainable. And we were at risk if we didn't become more integrated within the mission of the medical school, that if there was a certain transition and there were certain times, years, and it did happen where we didn't have the funding support from our traditional funders, that we would be at risk. There were a couple of years, about a decade ago, that I thought that we would have to close our doors. And so I made it was intentional of stepping back a little bit at that time from my responsibilities in the Simulation Society and some of the other international organizations, and really strengthening the foundation of the Gordon Center and its integration within the mission of the medical school. And over this past decade, in part because I assume some other leadership roles within the overall School of Medicine, including, as was mentioned earlier, as Senior Associate Dean for Research in Medical Education, and also Senior Associate Dean for Continuing Medical Education. I'm now part of the leadership team and you have a seat at the table in terms of how simulation will be adopted and integrated throughout the medical school mission. And based on that success, the next 10 years will be using that model and becoming more integrated and more aligned with the mission of our health system. To your point, Jeff, we also have our School of Medicine. And while we do have a separate health system and while their budgets are now shared, I think the movement will be over the next few years of having two independent bodies that obviously are synergistic, but nonetheless have at times competing interests. And we'll have to find a way to navigate through that balance. But I think ultimately the greatest impact that we can have as a simulation center is the impact we make at the health system level.
You've already described about 4 full-time jobs that you wear the hat for. Are there any other tasks or roles you do at the Gordon Center? and at the Miller School of Medicine?
I think that's one commonality as you meet and develop relationships. When I look at your signature line, Jeff, I see several, 4 or 5 different roles as well, and some of it is you take on these roles because the dean requests you to, because simulation does transcend several different missions of an academic institution, whether it's patient care, whether it's research, obviously education and training, and community outreach. That over time you're going to assume these different roles, and it's sometimes on the administrative side it can be taxing, but nonetheless, when you are part of the leadership team, you have more of an opportunity of ensuring how simulation can be used and how it can have an impact. It does require a little bit more time, but it also gives you a little bit more control and have a say of how it will be used. I guess one other thing that I've been involved with that may be important is that for several years, I was on the appointment, promotion, tenure committee and chaired it. And in that role, I was able to influence how education, people who wanted to devote their career to education, educational scholarship, was accepted and respected as a career option.
And what about your role as the Senior Associate Dean for Research and Medical Education? Did that kind of overlap with the promotions committee and your work there?
So the reason for that is that actually when the Gordon Center was designated, it was actually designated as the Michael S. Gordon Center for Research in Medical Education. And the way the centers of excellence are established is that if you are director of a center, you also carry the decanal title associated with directorship. And in my case, it was Senior Associate Dean for Research in Medical Education. And while that's more broad than just simulation, it did create a certain level of credibility and recognition for the role of medical education research, much that has already been in place for for research in basic science or the clinical science or translational sciences. And so it was a way of establishing within the structure and function of the School of Medicine that educational scholarship would begin to be on the same level of the clinical scholarship and the research scholarship. And in that role, one of the requirements when you're have a decanal title is to have a rotation on the school's appointment, promotion, tenure committee. And over the several years that I was on that committee, and then 2 years as chairing it, we were able to develop criteria and metrics so that those faculty who wanted to vote primarily into educational scholarship would be able to demonstrate that and then be rewarded for it in terms of their promotion.
Barry, I'm starting to believe you don't even sleep, because when we've co-authored papers too, we'll send you a version and it's almost like within an hour, it seems that we get it back. Do you have any time for clinical practice still? What's your clinical practice look like?
Well, it's a great question. I have been since a teenager, somewhat of an insomniac. I do my best and most creative work probably between about 11 p.m. and about 2 a.m. I'm not a morning person, although I do struggle to get up. I do a lot more tedious stuff in the morning. So again, it's a passion and joy that I have in the work that I do, and certainly the greatest part of that is the relationships you develop and the ability of working with other people. And I know, Jeff, you're one of those people, but it's just when you're creating something new and you're trying it out, and yes, it doesn't always go so well, but what you learn in the process, and then ultimately you see that success, there's nothing more gratifying. I do see patients. It's primarily more in the ward setting. So in 2-week out blocks throughout the year of serve as a ward attending in our public hospital, Jackson Health System. I'm working primarily with medical students and residents on that team. Earlier on in my career, I had a private patient practice in the clinics. And because I was on the road so much, and it's primarily because I was traveling, that I couldn't be there for them. And I'm not an emergency physician. I was internal medicine. And as an internist, you have to be there for your patients. You're not on a shift and then you're off a shift. You develop relationships. And I often found that I wasn't there for them. It wasn't fair to my colleagues that they always had to take call or answer a page. And so I just said that this particular point in my life, as I had this opportunity of trying to make an impact in simulation, that I have to pull back a little bit on that aspect.
Barry, let's move on and talk a little bit about your scholarly focus and specifically how you develop the scalable simulation solutions across your medical school residency training. And then, you talked about some of your work with systematic reviews. So can you just elucidate on your many years of scholarly work in simulation?
Again, early on, and this is as a medical student, when I was able to take that year off, I'd like to take credit on thinking about scalability when carrying out studies to evaluate the effectiveness of a new program, a new technology. And often when you look at the literature, they're small case studies. You develop a new technique, a new approach, and you test it in a population, and usually a convenience sample of 20 or 30 learners, sometimes a little bit more, and you show it's effective. And then oftentimes, one, is it repeatable, and is it scalable, and is it generalizable, is it transferable? All those are great questions. And one of the advantages of working with Michael Gordon is, from going back into the late 70s, they had the opportunity of and the need to evaluate and demonstrate the effectiveness of Harvey, which, again, simulation was not being used at all. And so in order for a very, very skeptical academic community of saying, why on earth would we adopt this new technology when we were all trained just perfectly learning on patients? And so Michael's approach at that time was to, he applied for a grant. He was actually awarded a grant at the a division of the NIH, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. They got a very large funding grant to do a multi-center study. The unique aspect of that is it had to be independently evaluated, the outcomes, by an independent group. It could not be any of the participating institutions. It certainly could have been the University of Miami, who also had a stake in the technology. And so they put out for bid of independent groups to serve as the evaluation. And one of those groups was the University of Illinois at Chicago. They had a very strong foundation in educational psychology. And one of their investigators, one of their faculty, was Christine McGuire, who is well known within the educational psychology community and actually early simulation community. She had done early work on various types of simulations using Howard Sounds recording, using program cases, and even standardized patient cases. And because of her unique background on evaluation, but also early forms of simulation, they were the group that was independently evaluated Harvey. And the bottom line was that is from the very beginning, the idea that you develop a solution that's going to be scalable, not just to your own institution, but transferable to other institutions is very key. And so when my first research studies that I was involved in was looking at evaluating the effectiveness of a multimedia curriculum to support simulation, it was done with 4 other institutions, because you learn a lot about how a new technology or new innovation is going to be implemented, because not every institution is the same. You may design it that way, that it's going to be implemented within a curriculum at a certain place, at a certain point in time. But there are all sorts of local factors, differences in faculty, differences in culture. And if you carry out a study where you're designing it so you're capturing those nuances, it's going to inform how you then later implement it more broadly. And also importantly, how you guide other institutions on what they need to be aware of, or some tips on how they can make it more effective. And one of those lessons learned from that study was the importance of getting buy-in from your curriculum leaders, whether it's a course director, whether it's a curriculum dean at the residency level, whether it's a program director. You're more likely to get success, both in the short term and long term, if you engage that leadership early on. And it's been one of the key aspects of your work at Northwestern, that it's no small accident that a lot of the effectiveness of the studies done with using internal medicine residents, and the translational impact and benefit of simulation at Northwestern was due in large part with the role of Diane Wayne, in her leadership role, not just within simulation, but more broadly in the training program. And that was a key lesson that we tried to convey to other institutions. If the leadership is not involved early on, it's so important to get them involved. Your new idea, your new innovation is more likely to be institutionalized as opposed to just a one-off that's going to be dependent on a champion that will ensure its success. But you want to make sure that innovation, that new idea, lasts beyond a single champion. And so those are some of a key lesson of some of the early scholarship that we did. One, the importance of getting buy-in from leadership. The second, trying to involve a second institution or a second site. If you have in a city such as Chicago or New York, or another large city where there's multiple schools within a small area, sometimes geographically that can make it more convenient. But now with technology, and certainly during the pandemic, we found ways to collaborate using digital technology that make it possible for multi-center collaboration. And in organizations such as the Society for Simulation in Healthcare and other now clinical organizations have infrastructure, have means of bringing people together to test new ideas and to implement more broadly. Part of the lessons learned at the medical student level in terms of how to integrate new simulation solutions, we also used that model when we wanted to integrate core fundamental skills across multiple residencies. As we did a project looking at different type of procedural skills that were required across surgery, internal medicine, pediatrics, obstetrics, gynecology. And as part of a research study, involved all of their program directors as well as the chief residents who were responsible for education and training, primarily during those years, to develop not vertically across a single discipline, but horizontally across multiple disciplines of evaluating the effectiveness of a simulation-based training. As I think about my career in scholarship and in simulation, I think one thing that I had that I was fortunate is that early on I had collaborators who were not really focused on simulation. Of course, they adopted it, but their main skill set, their main discipline was on just educational psychology and education and training. And so early on, I began viewing scholarship not from a simulation focus, but more from an education focus, where simulation was a tool or a technique to a more broader question of how do we design studies that really incorporate the latest science of how people learn. And it's why early on, many of our studies were grounded in the learning theory or conceptual framework of deliberate practice, of mastery learning. It's because I was part of a team whose discipline and focus was more generally education, and then simulation became just another tool in a whole toolbox of tools that could be an option for effective training and the outcomes that can result from effective training. And I would encourage those who are wanting to be involved in scholarship within simulation is that you have a diverse team. It's really hard to have expertise by yourself and the subject matter experts with the clinical discipline. the educational expertise, the evaluation expertise, the operational expertise. And so you want to have a team of diverse talents where collectively you're strong in all of those areas. And that's another thing I learned about how to have an impactful career in scholarship is to have a strong, diverse team. So after carrying out several of these multi-center studies, looking at the effectiveness of a particular type of simulation, whether it was Harvey or whether it was intravenous insertion, we thought that based in part by our group being invited to carry out an early systematic review called the Best Evidence Medical Education, or BEME review in simulation, to look to see if there were any common elements across simulation that could be applied, that could guide the simulation community and how to best implement simulation. It could be based on best practices. We knew it anecdotally because we worked with a variety of disciplines and specialties that were some common elements that were going to be, if not guarantee success, that increase the likelihood that you're going to have a successful program. But we wanted to be based on evidence, not just anecdote or our own work. And so one of the outcomes of the BEME review, and we were very surprised, those of us who were principal authors and the broader review team, of how much traction it had in terms of not just it being cited, but people taking the core 10 features that we identified across the literature that were more likely to lead to effective learning. It's almost like a checklist that if you were designing a program, you would design from the beginning elements that would incorporate curriculum integration, that would incorporate robust development of outcome measures, that would have opportunities for repetitive practice, and what we identified as the most important feature of having some form of feedback. That when you had more of these features as part of your simulation program, you're going to lead not only to better immediate outcomes, but more downstream outcomes that were likely to be sustained. And as a result of that, our original review had well over 600 studies. We decided, working with Bill McGahey at your institution, and then we wanted to narrow down and say, we know that there's a big literature out there. Why don't we focus on a smaller subset of those studies that had the most dramatic outcomes? What is it about those studies that have not just good immediate effects, but good downstream effects and more sustained impact? And so we did subsequent studies that internally we called the son and daughter of BEME. And Jeff, you and Diane Wayne have been part of those studies, where we looked more specifically at those studies that designed to have very strong intentional deliberate practice and mastery learning, and looking at the effect size of those studies when they had those elements explicitly designed in those studies. And we saw within that subset, and now there's a more broad literature base, that when you incorporate those very rigorous educational design features in the simulation, you're more likely to have a guaranteed strong impact, both in the short term, but more importantly, downstream, to have translational impact in the clinical setting. And then even more broadly, be able to demonstrate a return on investment in terms of not just a reduction of errors or, as you know, a reduction of length of stay, of complications, but even a financial impact within the health system.
You know, Barry, you brought up a few things that I'm very passionate about, obviously. And one of the things that you talked about is the need to do multi-center trials and simulation showing the impact of medical education. I have talked about this with several other interviewees on my podcast, and it seems like that is the missing link of evidence that we might need to push simulation into the next realm and really have it adopted and embraced. So my challenge for you, as the president-elect of the Society for Simulation in Healthcare, is to help get this consortium, a research consortium of medical educators in simulation, together so that we can more easily navigate this field of multi-center trials?
I almost backed into it at the University of Miami, the Gordon Center, and some of the core institutions that we worked with in the early days, is because there wasn't a simulation society. There was no group of people coming together. And so it was really whoever was doing it at that point. We realized that, at a necessity, we would kind of develop our own consortium. Now you have the Society for Simulation in Healthcare and other organizations where you do have a means for people to come together. Well, that's only one step. Then you have to have commitment of the leadership they're going to invest in giving those people who are coming together and are willing to give their time, investment and support so they can carry out these studies. So it's one thing for me as incoming president to say, well, I'm going to be doing this and I'm going to be doing that. It's much stronger if you already have alignment with the overall society. And I know more recently you've had a podcast with Haru Okuda, who's the past president, immediate past president for Simulation Society. He recently led a strategic visioning exercise where the society has outlined its next 5-year strategic plan. And one of the key components is on research, and for the society to make a commitment to support research. This is also evidence that the last IMSH in Orlando is preceded by a 2-day research summit that incorporated several teams looking at the literature and identifying strategic areas of research. This has also coincided with for the first time, this is society setting up an endowment fund. And a big component of that fund is to support research. And I think what we can do in terms of the leadership of the Simulation Society is to, if not make an explicit criteria, give greater weight for those applications for research dollars that are designed as multi-center studies. And I think we could be more proactive about that, because ultimately we want to have stronger evidence. And while the one-off study within a single institution are great, I think we're well beyond that. We have 40 years of evidence about that. And one of the roles that the society can play is to foster and not just talk about the need for doing multi-center studies, but providing the means and support to make it happen. I know there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm to do so. It's been reflected on several of the people that you've had as part of your podcast. And I think there's a lot of support, not just at the president level, but throughout the board of directors, among the past presidents, that we're going to make this happen over the next 2 or 3 years.
What other plans do you have for the future as you become the president of the society?
In addition to research, another large area of focus is advocacy. And it's a word thrown around a lot. For me, it's one is promoting what you're doing, and not just promoting what you're doing, but why you're doing it. The Simulation Society for Simulation Healthcare does a good job of talking about simulation itself. It's got accreditation for simulation, certification for simulation. There's even a new word called simulationist. And that's great to develop a community. But for those stakeholders that we want to engage more broadly out in the community, health systems, large foundations, they're more interested in what we're going to do with simulation as opposed to simulation itself. They want us to solve problems that are meaningful to them. And it's not about being a simulationist. It's about improving healthcare, providing equity and access, reducing errors, being more cost effective. And we have to, as a simulation society, lead with that and say, we're going to use simulation as a tool, but more broadly, our goals are aligned with yours. And I think that's the message that we have to lead with. It's certainly one that has worked for us at the Gordon Center. When I have discussions now with donors or with legislators, simulation comes up, but it's we don't lead with simulation. It's about saving lives. It's about reducing errors. It's about improving healthcare outcomes. It's about expanding the scope of practice among allied healthcare workers or first responders, because that's what they're interested in. They appreciate we're going to use whatever tool or technology or science to get us there. And so I think as part of that advocacy, we have to really understand from the point of view of those people we want to partner, what's important to them, clearly communicate that, and I think the support will follow. That's more broadly about advocacy, and there's many different areas that we'll have to approach, both from the top down and the bottom up. But one area that I hope that we can move more intentionally is to partner with broader health systems. And this might be at the national level or with the regional level, because I think they're ready to support simulation in so much that it can address their needs in terms of improving efficiencies in healthcare, of reducing error, reducing the number of emissions. And I know that you've discussed this with several other people you've had on your podcast. We haven't done a good job. We haven't really moved the needle in terms of where we need to be related to outcomes and patient safety. And I think we're mature enough. We need to be more intentional in that area. And so I hope over these next 2 or 3 years to reach out to some of those large organizations and not just have the conversations, because we've been talking about this for more than 2 decades of actually doing something about it.
So Barry, wow, that's a lot. We covered a lot of ground here. Of course, that's why we had to divide this into 2 podcasts. But thank you so much for sharing your career and your insights on healthcare simulation.
No, it's been a true joy to spend this time with you, Jeff. I want to thank you again for reaching out. We ran into each other in Orlando at the IMSH. It's also one of the benefits of a meeting like that, because it's the serendipity of running into people. It wasn't planned, and you reached out. I guess I had known you'd done a podcast because Bill McGahey and Paul Frampus had told me about it. But just want to thank you for this opportunity, because in our busy lives, unless someone like you comes to us and we put it on the schedule and have an opportunity to talk about it, I never would have done it. So thank you.
Thank you for listening today. In future podcasts, we will continue to discuss key aspects of simulation healthcare education with experts in the field. Bye for now.